Hello. I need your advice. I'm sitting in a bar right now writing this story, but a couple of weeks ago, my life was completely destroyed. Not long ago, I thought everything in my life was in its place. A beautiful wife, a loyal best friend, a stable job. I never strived for more. It seemed to me that I was already living that very American dream. But one short phone call turned everything upside down. Now I'm here with an almost empty glass of whiskey, thinking about how I ended up like this. How did everything fall apart so quickly? I want to tell you my story, not because I'm looking for sympathy, but because I can't keep it inside anymore. I hope you'll listen to it to the end and maybe help me find the answer I'm so desperately searching for. There were only two people in my life whom I could call family, apart from my actual relatives. My wife Alice and my best friend Michael. We were like a trio that stuck together for years. Alice was my first love, whom I met back in college. Michael was the friend who always offered a shoulder when life threw challenges my way. That evening began like any other. Alice seemed to be in a good mood. We had dinner together and she laughed a lot, although her phone occasionally distracted her. I thought it was work and didn't ask unnecessary questions. It was almost 9 p.m. when I suddenly remembered I hadn't seen Michael in a while. Lately, he seemed very busy, so I decided it was time to drag him out to the bar like we used to. Alice didn't mind. She even smiled and said, "Yes, you definitely need to unwind a little, darling." I called Michael. That call changed everything. Calls to Michael were always easygoing. We could talk for hours, discussing weekend plans or just exchanging news. This time was supposed to be the same. I planned to invite him to the bar to relax like we had done before. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. I was already thinking Michael wouldn't pick up when the connection was suddenly cut. And instead of the expected, "Hey, John," I heard something else. First, it was a strange sound. Muffled, barely audible. It seemed like the microphone had brushed against some fabric. And then it became clearer, heavy breathing. It was rhythmic, ragged. And at that moment, my imagination began painting the worst scenarios. "Mike!" I said his name, though my voice trembled traitorously. No response. But I heard a moan. A low, satisfied sound that pierced me through. My heart clenched, and my fingers gripped the phone tightly. I called out again. "Mike, are you there?" It wasn't just a sound anymore. This time I heard a voice. It was hers. My Alice. "Oh, Mike Moore." Those words hit me like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. Every cell in my body refused to believe what I just heard. I froze, like a marionette whose strings had been cut. I wanted to believe it was a terrible coincidence, that it couldn't be true. But her voice, her intonation, it was all too real. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice, and said for the 3rd time, "Mike, can you hear me?" There was silence for a few seconds. Then he responded, his voice barely muffled. "Wait, I think it's John." They both laughed. Their laughter hit me like an icy wind, leaving only emptiness in its wake. I heard Michael say something, but I couldn't make out the words anymore. I hung up the phone, not knowing what to do. My mind was blank. I stared at the phone screen as if it were a portal to some other world, one I no longer belonged to. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to comprehend if this was really happening. With each passing minute, doubts faded, leaving space for the bitter truth. Michael and Alice. Betrayal. By dawn, I knew I had to confirm it. I needed to see it with my own eyes. The morning was cold and gray. The sky was overcast with clouds that hung low on the horizon, as if pressing down on everything around. The air smelled of moisture, and it felt like rain could start at any moment. I sat in the car, holding the keys in my hand. I turned them between my fingers from time to time, but didn't start the engine. My head was exploding with thoughts. Part of me wanted to believe that this was all just a misunderstanding, that I had misheard, that my mind, filled with doubts, had played a cruel trick on me. But another part, the far more rational one, understood it was the truth. I took a deep breath, inserted the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine came to life, but I still sat there, unmoving. Even the warm air coming from the heater couldn't dispel the cold that gripped me from within. My path led to Michael's apartment. That place was well known to me, as I'd been there dozens of times. We often got together to watch football, drink beer, or just talk. I trusted him just as much as I trusted Alice. But now that place had become a symbol of betrayal. The drive to the apartment felt endlessly long. The radio played some old melody, but I couldn't even make out the words. My thoughts circled the same thing over and over. It felt like I wasn't driving forward, but deeper into my own mind, to the very root of the pain tearing me apart. As I approached Michael's building, I slowed down and parked a few dozen meters away. I took another deep breath, trying to calm myself, but my heart was pounding like crazy. Light shone from the window on the third floor, which I immediately recognized. The shadows of two people flickered behind the curtains. I left the car and headed for the entrance. The steps under my feet felt unusually steep, though in reality, they were the same 3 floors I'd climbed hundreds of times before. Every step echoed in the silence, like hammer blows. And then there was the door I used to open without hesitation, without even knocking. But now everything was different. I didn't know what awaited me on the other side, but I couldn't just walk away. I knocked, my fist clenched involuntarily, leaving marks on the wooden surface. I heard whispers behind the door, then footsteps. When the door opened, Michael appeared before me. His appearance was unexpectedly calm. His hair was tousled, and there was a faint smile on his face. "Hey, John," he said as if nothing had happened. His calmness threw me off balance. For a moment, I even forgot why I was standing there. Then everything hit me again like a wave. The voices on the phone, the laughter, the shadows behind the curtains. "Is Alice here?" I asked, my voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. He sighed and nodded. Then he stepped aside, inviting me in. I crossed the threshold and saw her. Alice was sitting on the couch wearing Michael's t-shirt. Her hair was messy, but her face was calm, almost indifferent. She looked up as I entered, and our eyes met. "Oh, John," was all she said. When our eyes met, time seemed to freeze. I stood there like a statue at the entrance to Michael's living room, and Alice sat on the couch, making no attempt to hide her guilt. This wasn't the moment where people offer excuses or try to avoid an answer. No, this was something else. Her face remained unperturbed, almost emotionless, and that indifference hit harder than any accusation. "Do you need something?" She broke the silence, her voice calm, even lazy. That question pierced me like a sharp knife. I didn't know what to say. Thousands of words swirled in my head, but not one could escape my mouth. "How could you?" I finally managed to say. Alice shrugged, as if my reaction was predictable but not worth discussing. "John," she said, looking at me tiredly, "let's not dramatize this. You knew it yourself." Her words struck another blow. I knew? What did I know? Could I have imagined that the people I trusted the most would betray me so openly, without remorse? "What do you mean?" My hands were trembling as I spoke. "This didn't happen overnight, John," she sighed, standing up and walking to the window. "I've been tired of our marriage for a long time. Everything became, well, so dull." I stared at her, unable to believe my ears. "And so you went to my friend?" I barely contained myself from raising my voice. At this point, Michael intervened in the conversation. He stood by the door, arms crossed over his chest, with an expression that held not a trace of shame. "John, enough. You know this was inevitable. You're too, how should I put it, soft. Alice needs someone who can offer more." His words hit me harder than I could have imagined. Too soft? What did that mean? Was my desire to maintain harmony in our relationship the reason for all of this? "I trusted you, Mike," I said, looking him straight in the eyes. "I always thought of you as a brother." Michael sighed and shook his head. "You trusted me, but that means nothing. Sorry, buddy, but in life, the one who wins is the one who takes what they want." That sentence was the last straw. My patience had run out. I didn't want to listen to their excuses or their poison anymore. I turned and walked out of the apartment without saying another word. As the door closed behind me, I heard them resume their conversation. Their laughter filtered through the walls, tearing apart the remnants of what used to be my life. I walked out of Michael's building, barely seeing the path ahead. The world around me seemed blurred, as if I were inside an old film. Each step echoed hollowly, like hammer blows ringing through the empty night streets. My breathing grew heavy, but not from physical exertion, rather from the crushing weight on my chest. The air was damp and cold, though I didn't notice. It was colder inside me. I sat in the car, leaving the door open, and stared at the steering wheel. Everything that had happened replayed in my mind like a broken record. The voices, the laughter, their faces, their indifference. How did it come to this? I muttered to myself, though the words sounded empty. My body was there, in the car, but my mind wandered somewhere in the abyss. When I tried to think about what to do next, the answer seemed so far away, as if it never existed. I sat motionless for a few minutes, until one thought began to form in my mind. It wasn't revenge, nor aggression, but the desire to escape, simply disappear. I couldn't stay here, in this city where every corner reminded me of betrayal. I started the car and drove off, with no clear destination. My path led me through empty streets, where lonely streetlights cast long shadows. The asphalt glistened after the rain, and the windshield slowly became speckled with drops that began to fall from the sky. I didn't go home. For the first time in years, my home no longer felt like a place I could return to. Everything there was soaked with memories of Alice. Photos on the walls, her things in the closets, her scent. The road brought me to an old bar on the outskirts of town. The bar looked just as tired as I felt. The sign glowed dimly, its neon letters flickering. I walked inside and was immediately greeted by the smell of cheap cigarettes and spilled beer. A few people sat at the bar, each lost in their own world. I walked up to the counter and sat on an empty stool. The bartender, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache, didn't even ask what I wanted. He simply poured a glass of whiskey and placed it in front of me. I picked up the glass and took a large sip. It burned my throat, but it was a pleasant, dull pain that temporarily dulled the one burning me from the inside. "Rough day?" the bartender asked, leaning on the counter. I looked at him but couldn't summon the strength to answer. He seemed to understand and didn't press further. I was left alone with my thoughts. The hours blurred into something undefined. Each glass of alcohol became a temporary reprieve from the pain, but it always came back. I felt myself sinking deeper and deeper into darkness, but I couldn't stop anymore. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was the beginning of the end. But at that moment, it felt like the only way out. With every minute in the bar, I felt myself slipping further into the abyss. Each sip of whiskey seemed to consume a part of my feelings. First, there was pain, then apathy. The lightness I felt after each new drink quickly passed, leaving only emptiness, a bitter emptiness from which there was no escape. I could no longer tell where my suffering ended and the alcohol began. The bartender didn't speak to me again, likely realizing that words were meaningless. I sat there, staring into my glass, unaware of how much time had passed. I didn't care how many hours had slipped by or who was around me. My consciousness slowly blurred, but that no longer frightened me. It felt as though I had become part of the darkness, part of this world where there was no room for love, only pain and loneliness. Suddenly, I felt someone's presence nearby. Someone had taken a seat on the stool next to me. I didn't even look up, knowing it was unlikely to matter. In places like this, people come and go, but nothing really changes. "You look like a man who's lost everything." The voice was rough but not hostile. Maybe it was just another patron who decided to talk to a drunken stranger. I raised my eyes, not expecting any support. Before me stood a middle-aged man, wearing a wrinkled coat with a stain on the collar that might even have been blood. He had a stern expression, but there was a strange calm about him. I sensed that he knew more than he was willing to say, and for some reason that scared me. "Lost everything, huh?" He looked at me with a faint, somber gaze. I didn't respond, taking another sip instead. Rather than turning away, he only leaned in closer and said, "What, waiting for something to happen to her? Hoping everything will go back to the way it was?" Those words pierced me like a knife. I didn't answer, but he continued to look at me as though trying to see something deeper, something I wasn't ready to reveal. "She's with him, and that's it. She's gone for you. That's all you need to understand, boy." He tilted his head slightly, but there wasn't even a spark of sympathy in his eyes. For the first time that day, I lifted my head and looked him in the eyes. His gaze was cold and sharp, as if he had already seen many people like me. People who couldn't stand against their own weaknesses. People trying to find justice in a world where none exists. "You don't know what you're talking about," I muttered, but my words rang hollow. I didn't believe what I had just said, yet something inside me still clung to hope. A small, fragile hope that everything could still be changed. The man didn't reply. He simply smiled faintly. We all lose ourselves in the end when we try to do what's right for others. Sometimes it's better to just let go. Move on, even if it hurts. I remained silent, his words clouding my thoughts like a dark storm. But it wasn't that simple. I couldn't just let go of my wife. Or Michael. They were a part of me, a part of my world, and I didn't know how to live without them. Meanwhile, I felt the alcohol working stronger on me. I began to lose clarity, unable to pinpoint when I started speaking to the bartender again, or when I lifted my glass to my lips once more. The seconds dragged endlessly, but soon the bar began to empty. People left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I finished my last sip, set the glass down, and stepped out of the bar, feeling my legs lose their steadiness. With each step, with each new wave of cold air wrapping around me, I felt more and more that the old man had been right. Maybe I hadn't been the person I thought I was for a long time. Maybe I had forgotten who I wanted to be. I don't remember how much time passed before I ended up on my street. The entire night had swallowed me, like a black abyss devouring every last shred of light. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, and the street was almost empty, with only a few scattered fireflies along the roadside. The streetlights appeared as blurred smudges, only deepening my sense of confusion. I walked along the sidewalk, against my own will, unable to determine where exactly I was headed. It seems I made it back home, but why didn't it feel like a return? The door was left ajar, and that was the first signal that something wasn't right. I stood on the threshold, staring into the empty apartment. This place had changed. Without her, without them. I always thought that in life, there is a moment when everything stops and begins anew. But that never happened. My entire routine vanished the moment I learned the truth. And now there was nothing. No home, no memories, no desire. Only pain and questions. And more importantly, nothing to hold on to. I entered the room that once looked like a place where I could find my purpose. Now it was just an empty space I couldn't fill. I sat on the edge of the bed, unable to believe what had happened. How could I, a man who had worked for years to build a family, lose everything so quickly? How was this even possible? Every thought of Alice brought me pain. I couldn't understand how I had failed to notice what was happening behind my back. True betrayal isn't just a physical act. It's losing people you had the deepest connections with and having no idea why. She had been my entire world, and now that world was falling apart. And then I realized I couldn't remain like this anymore. I could no longer carry this emptiness. All my attempts to find an answer to what had happened and why only increased my helplessness. I couldn't leave it in the past. I couldn't just forget what they had done. Stay in this void or take a step that would change everything. A step from which there would be no return. I felt like I was standing on the edge, and it wasn't a metaphor. The word edge carried the full bitterness of my emotions. All the despair and disappointment I now carried within me. I stepped out onto the balcony. The cold night wind caressed my face, and I took a deep breath. The gust of air cooling my lungs wasn't as fresh as it once had been. Now it felt different, like it was penetrating my very soul, making me feel hollow. This wasn't just an ordinary crisis. This was the edge. This was the moment when life changes, and you don't know if you're ready to survive it. But one thing was certain, I could no longer remain the man I used to be. Couldn't. And whatever I did next would be a decision that couldn't be undone. And suddenly, for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt the urge to drink again. I hadn't planned it. I didn't want it. But it had become the only way to feel something other than emptiness. I went downstairs to the car, tossed the keys into my pocket, and drove back to that same bar. I wasn't thinking about the future. I only knew that, for tonight, it was the only place where I could escape reality, even if just for a moment. With each sip, I consumed part of myself. I could have searched for answers in other people or even therapists, but I was too broken to do so. So I stayed here, where every drink felt like another step into the abyss. Abandoning consciousness was perhaps the only way I could survive this rupture. But my heart still beat inside me, and it refused to find peace. Something in me was changing. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was bitterness, flooding me like a wave. I was no longer the man I had been before. Now I simply existed. Perhaps that was the only truth. I took another sip, once again experiencing loneliness, yet at the same time realizing that maybe this was my new life. Time became imperceptible. Day turned into night, and night became day again. Everything flowed into one unending stream, and I couldn't find the strength to stop it. Over and over, I returned to that same bar, running from reality and my memories. Each time I drank, I felt reality blur, the pain becoming less distinct. But every next sip only pulled me deeper into the darkness, and I knew I would never find my way back. The bar became my refuge, a place where I could forget who I was, if only for a while. There were other people there, like me, searching for a way to escape their problems. But I was different. I wasn't just seeking oblivion. I was becoming part of this dark mass, part of something that devours a person, leaving no chance for salvation. I felt like I was trapped in a cage with no way out. I had no friends to turn to. Michael was no longer my friend, and Alice was no longer my wife. They had become strangers, even unfamiliar figures in my memories. And I didn't know what to do with all these emotions that brought no relief, only pain. I sat at the bar, drunk and absent, staring into an empty glass. Liters of alcohol couldn't erase the moment I heard the moans over the phone. What had happened lingered in my mind, refusing to let me go. I tried to close my eyes to it, but every time, I returned to that call again and again. At one point, the bartender approached me with another bottle of whiskey, and without looking at him, I ordered another drink. "You need to think about where you're heading," he said quietly, as if he had been watching me all along. He was right, but I couldn't do it. I didn't have the strength to change anything. I didn't have the strength to fight what had happened. The entire situation, this whole reality before me, seemed too complicated to figure out. I was just drifting, and drifting was easier than trying to understand how I ended up here. The bartender looked at me but said nothing. His silence spoke more than any words. I could feel his gaze cutting through me, but I didn't respond. He simply placed another glass in front of me. I picked it up without flinching and took a large sip. Meanwhile, the night enveloped the city, and I remained there as always, alone, with a foggy head and a dark abyss in my heart. It felt like something was relentlessly pulling me down, and I couldn't stop it. Every move I made led me closer to the edge. My soul had become heavy, like a stone, and now I was merely collecting fragments of my former self, not knowing if I'd ever be whole again. One evening, I found myself on the street again, wandering aimlessly, searching for something I couldn't find. My mind was no more than a foggy cloud, and my body, an empty vessel through which only memories and pain passed. I didn't know how much time had passed until I was back in the same place, outside my house. Maybe it was a sign, or maybe it was just habit. Now, I could no longer tell the difference. I stood on the doorstep, looking at the familiar interior, feeling something heavy pressing down on me. Everything seemed so familiar yet so distant. It felt like I no longer had a purpose in this life. My reality had lost its meaning. I tried to step into the house again, but as I stood on the threshold, I felt a sudden urge to leave. Not to return, but simply to leave and never look back. I took a few steps backward, and in that moment, I realized I didn't want to be here anymore. All I could do was move forward. And though it wasn't an escape, it was the only path I could choose. So I stepped out onto the street, leaving the house and everything tied to it behind. But I didn't know if it was the right choice, because usually when you leave, there's no chance to return. The night was as empty as everything that remained after my actions. The street seemed to have lost all meaning. Every step echoed dully, as if this world no longer belonged to me. I walked aimlessly, not knowing why, but deep in my heart, I felt there would be no going back. All the familiar places, all the memories, had become nothing but an illusion of what my life once was. I couldn't leave this city. This was my place, my home. Even if now everything was different, I didn't go back home. No, I ventured into the unknown. And in that unknown, there was only me. A man everyone had left. A man who had nothing left but to drink and wait for it all to pass. I found myself back at the bar, and once again, alone. This had become my reality. I sat, looking at the bartender, but I didn't see him. I didn't see anything. Just the drunken days and nights, which felt as empty as I did. I couldn't leave this behind. My life had become a cycle, and I no longer had a place in it. The bartender approached me again. His gaze remained just as stern, and he quietly asked, "What are you looking for?" I didn't answer because I couldn't. I wasn't looking for anything except oblivion. But as always, it didn't help. It brought no relief, and my heart remained as heavy as a stone. Something needed to change. Something that would allow me to break free from this endless circle. And then I saw someone in the corner of the bar. A young woman sitting, staring at her phone. She looked familiar. Maybe I had seen her before, maybe not. But her gaze was empty, and I felt like we were both drowning in the same darkness I had been trying to escape. She looked at me, and I felt her eyes searching for something they couldn't find. Maybe it was compassion, or maybe it was just the longing that wouldn't let her go. And suddenly, it became clear to me that I couldn't sit in this bar anymore. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just sit and drink, waiting for it all to pass. I stood up, left a few dollars on the table, and walked toward the door. I didn't look back, but I felt that, at this point, I was no longer the person I used to be. Each step carried me further from the past but brought me no peace. I walked, knowing there were still many roads ahead of me to travel. Outside, it was getting colder. The air was so crisp that I could feel it filling my lungs. And although it was unpleasant, I sensed that something had changed. Maybe it was anger. Maybe just the desire to find a way to feel at least something. I stopped in the street and looked at the stars that had started to appear in the sky. The moon was still hiding behind the clouds, but it seemed as though it would soon break free, just as I wanted to break free from this cycle of loneliness. Maybe this was a moment of awakening. Maybe it was what I had been waiting for all along without realizing it. But now I knew I couldn't stay in the shadows. The shadows of betrayal, the shadows of pain, the shadows of isolation. I slowly walked toward the park nearby. Among the trees, I could find peace. And maybe I could once again understand what I truly needed in this life. I no longer needed to escape into alcohol to forget. I was searching for something else. Something that would allow me to return to myself. The entire way, I could feel the decision approaching, as if the next step was becoming clearer. I didn't yet know whether I would become my true self again or remain the man I had been before this dark night. But one thing was certain, I couldn't go on living like this. And although I couldn't yet see the end of this path, I already felt that it would be difficult. Difficult, but right. Maybe I would find myself again. Maybe I would become the person I could have been if I took responsibility for my actions. But that would be another story. The park was empty. The night swallowed every corner of this place, but I still felt a quiet strength here. Maybe it was the sound of the wind rustling through the branches of the trees, or maybe it was just my thoughts, growing louder than the world itself. I sat on one of the benches, wrapped in darkness, and closed my eyes. Time stopped. I felt it simply passing by while I sat still, as though I were part of something greater, something unclear. But even in this quiet place, I couldn't escape my thoughts. They pulled me back, again and again, to that phone call. that horrifying moment when I heard the moans. I felt my heart clench, as though someone was tearing it apart, and I couldn't understand why I hadn't realized it earlier. Why had I let her, Alice, walk so easily out of my life? And the worst part was, I didn't even understand that with Michael. It had never been a coincidence. It was their betrayal, their plan, and I was the last to know. I felt the anger and disappointment swelling so intensely that they could explode at any moment. What had they tried to do to me? How could they play me like that? They had taken my naivety, my kindness, my loyalty, and used it as a weapon. And now I was left alone, betrayed by my own pain, which forced me to search for something to help me survive it. My thoughts were like an endless spiral. I couldn't stop myself, and every time I returned to those memories, I felt the anger burning stronger inside me. She was my wife and he was my friend. How did I not see it before? How did I not feel it when it was so obvious to everyone else? I needed to change something. But what? My mind kept returning to that bar, to that place where I sought solace. Only now did I realize that I couldn't find answers there. I could keep drinking, but it wouldn't help. It would only deepen my despair. I stood there, staring at the sky. On the dark canvas of the night, I could see millions of stars. And suddenly, I was overwhelmed by the feeling that I was trying to find something that didn't exist. Like those stars, so distant. Yet I kept looking at them, trying to understand their meaning. Just as I was trying to find meaning in what had happened to me. And then it hit me. I didn't have any more time to waste looking for answers in places where there were none. I needed to do something to move forward. And though I didn't know what that would look like, I felt that this step would be important. I couldn't stay here, and I could no longer be the person I had been. I looked at the stars again. They weren't the stars I was used to looking at. These were cold, distant lights that reminded me of my lack of purpose. Maybe they were like my life, distant and unknown. But now I was ready to change something. Maybe this was the first step toward change. I rose from the bench and walked on. My mind was so clouded that I didn't know where I was heading. But deep down, I felt that these steps were the only ones I could take. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I could no longer stay in this dead-end cycle. The decision was as simple as day and night. Leave it all behind. And though it would be hard, though it would bring pain, I could no longer stay in that place where every day looked the same as the last. I was ready to change everything that had come before this moment. Now I believed I had to do it. Morning came slowly. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting its first rays on the empty streets of the city. But for me, this wasn't the start of a new day. It was just another attempt to escape reality. Another illusion that life might return to what it once was. My legs carried me through familiar streets, but everything looked different. The city seemed to blur, and I couldn't find my place in it. My body felt heavy, like the earth, and every step took me further from what once seemed important. I thought about Alice and Michael, about how they had pushed me to this moment. But as soon as I thought of them, something inside me broke. I didn't want to think anymore about what they had done. Their betrayal had left me with only emptiness and sorrow, but it no longer mattered. Instead, I searched for answers within myself. I still didn't know where I was going, but at least now I wasn't afraid to move forward. This feeling was new, and it burned inside me like fire. I was no longer the man who sat in that bar days ago. I had changed, and now this was my reality. I couldn't stop because every day without action seemed impossible. I arrived at the park I knew so well, and though I no longer sought peace there, the park had become my place to sort through what was happening in my mind. Now I needed to start over, and though it seemed unrealistic whether I wanted to or not, I had to find a way to begin. I felt that I needed to let go, to forget, and to rebuild myself. I sat on the same bench where I had sat just days ago, waiting for change. Now I was ready. Maybe I could no longer return to my old life, but I could create a new reality for myself. All my former illusions and hopes had been shattered, but I was still alive, and that was already a victory. The park was quiet, but I began to feel a different energy flowing through me. It wasn't a sense of hope. Rather, it was a strength born from the realization that I was no longer afraid. I wasn't afraid of change, and that was new for me. I was ready to take the first step, even if that step would be hard and painful. On the bench next to me sat a woman. She was so familiar that I immediately knew who she was. Her name was Sarah, a former colleague, a woman I had crossed paths with a few times in the past. She was quiet, modest, but I had always felt that beneath her calm exterior hid a depth of emotions. I didn't know why she was here, but her presence calmed me. Her eyes, filled with wisdom, eyes that had seen more than I could comprehend, now looked at me with quiet curiosity. She didn't ask what had happened, didn't judge me. She simply sat there, and that gave me more than I could have asked for. We didn't talk for long, but her silence was a wonderful remedy for my soul. She was a part of this world, which, though it seemed foreign, still mattered to me. I didn't know where I was going, but sitting there with her, I felt that at least something in my life remained stable. Every moment with Sarah was a reminder that even after the greatest losses, you can find yourself again. And though I didn't yet know what lay ahead, this was the first time I felt I could start over. We sat there for a few more minutes, and then Sarah looked at me, silently rose and walked away. She didn't say a word about what had happened between us in the past, but I knew it was important. She left me with her understanding, her patience, and that was enough. Now I could move forward, even though I didn't know where exactly this path would lead me. I left the bench, took one last look at the empty park, and walked on. My journey wasn't over, and I didn't know how it would end, but I was ready to face what would come. And though this step was painful, it was my decision to move forward, even without knowing where. The sun was slowly rising, but in the city it already felt late. I walked through the streets, feeling how every step took me further away from everything that had happened. This wasn't just the first day. It was the first reality I was trying to step into after the betrayal. My heart pounded heavily, as if trying to break free from my chest, and I didn't know what I feared more, the shadow of the past or what lay ahead. The space around me was empty, but it wasn't a quiet emptiness. It was more like a vacuum filled with meaning, where every detail mattered, yet I couldn't grasp it. I walked without a clear purpose, driven only by inertia, like a blind man searching for light. But there was no light, and I knew it. I felt my body moving through the city, but my soul remained lost in some dark corridor of memories. My thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. I kept thinking about what had happened with Alice and Michael, how they succumbed to temptation, how their betrayal tore me apart. Why didn't I see it earlier? Why did I allow myself to leave it all behind and just keep living? I couldn't stop this internal monologue. It gave me no peace. I returned to it again and again. And maybe that's why I didn't notice when I approached the familiar old cafe. It was the same place where I used to sit with friends back when life didn't feel like an empty void. I stopped in front of its doors, and for a moment, it felt as if I was standing on the edge of something important. I had the sense that this place might give me something that would help me understand how I had ended up here. The cafe was quiet, but I still felt like I was in the eye of a storm. The barista looked familiar, and I realized he had worked here since the days when I came with friends. I sat at a table in the corner, pressing my hands against the surface, as if trying to hold on to reality. The barista glanced at me with doubt, but said nothing. Maybe he had seen me before, maybe not, but there was something in his gaze that reminded me that at some point we all end up alone with our pain. I ordered a coffee and started watching the people passing by the cafe windows. They walked by, living their lives, and I felt that I no longer belonged to this world. This world was not mine. I couldn't just take it all back and return to what existed before that phone call, before that moment when I heard those sounds. That sound had become my curse. I couldn't forget it, no matter how hard I tried. It had become a part of me. I drank my coffee, not noticing its taste. Everything around me was blurry, but I felt that something in my heart was starting to change. Maybe I couldn't go back to the past anymore. Maybe I was no longer who I once was, but perhaps I could find myself again. Perhaps there was a reason in these memories and this pain that would allow me to become stronger, even if it was a path through suffering. I decided I needed to take another step. I slowly stood up from the table and walked towards the exit. Maybe it wasn't the best moment to make any serious decisions, but I had nothing left to lose. I could stay in the shadows, but that wouldn't lead to anything good. From the street, it looked like just another ordinary day, but I felt how everything around me was changing. I was no longer the person I used to be. It was the moment I realized I couldn't keep living as I had before. Staying in the pain would have been easier than deciding something, but I couldn't allow myself to stay in that state anymore. I stepped out onto the street, and now there was only one thing left for me: to find a way forward. And though that path was unclear, I felt that I had taken the first step. And maybe, even if it would all hurt, I would keep moving forward. Now, trying to find a new place, a new direction, I felt this wasn't just a path to forgetfulness. It was a path to change. Time had lost its meaning. Days blended together, and I couldn't say for sure what day of the week it was. It no longer mattered. My mind remained clouded, and though I had begun moving forward again, I struggled to understand what exactly I was looking for. I hadn't returned to old habits, and I hadn't gone back to the bar. I simply walked, and the city became my unyielding witness. The sky was dark, and it seemed as though even the night had become part of this internal chaos. I strolled through the streets, sometimes bumping into people, sometimes passing by them without a glance. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I felt how my steps grew heavier, how every movement brought me closer to those memories I couldn't get out of my head. Alice and I had spent many years together. She was my life, my support, and though she had long stopped being the ideal she once was at the beginning of our relationship, I still believed that everything could change. I believed that our love was capable of overcoming any hardship. But I hadn't noticed how she had distanced herself, how Michael had become something foreign to me. Their betrayals were not accidental mistakes, but conscious choices, and that made it even worse. I became a relentless seeker of answers, trying to find any explanation, no matter how it sounded. I began revisiting every detail of our life together, every moment when I might have understood something but didn't. Again and again I found the same picture, a face I loved, but now there was more lies in it than truth. All these thoughts kept swirling in my head until I found myself on an old street where I once lived. It was a microscopic part of the city that remained unchanged. I stood at the corner where Alice and I might have first had a real conversation. We laughed, talked about our plans for the future, dreamed. I remembered that moment clearly, and it became a painful contrast to what had happened now. I decided to go into her old store, the place where she had worked before we completely understood each other. It was now closed, with a sign on the door that read, "Closed." But as I got closer, I noticed the door wasn't locked. I quietly turned the handle and walked inside. This was the place where we once spent time together, where I would meet her after work. Now it was dark and empty. My heart was racing, and every step inside this emptiness felt endless. I looked at the old shelves that still held empty boxes and remnants of products. Here, in this store, I could feel the scent of her perfume, her hands, her presence. But it was all just an echo, the remnants of something I could no longer return to. Walking through the empty rooms, I felt like a completely different person. The place that once symbolized our love now looked bleak. All the memories I carried with me blended with the absurdity of this empty space. I was like a broken part of something big, but I no longer understood how it had all become this way. In these moments, I felt how hard it was for me to stay grounded. I didn't know what people around me wanted from me. They all lived their lives, while I felt myself sinking deeper into darkness. I had no clear goal, didn't know where I was going, but the knowledge that I wasn't alone, though lonely in my pain, gave me the strength to keep going. And at that moment, I felt the inner pain grow stronger. It was like a constant pressure on my chest. It wasn't physical pain, but emotional. And it was so intense that it felt like the whole world was crashing down on me at once. I stepped out of the store, and the cold wind embraced me, as if reminding me that I hadn't yet found my answers. But it was just one of many stations on this path. I had to be ready for the fact that it wasn't over yet. Time still remained my greatest enemy. Today, I couldn't find the starting point from which I could understand how this path would end. I woke up in the morning with a heavy feeling, as if after a sleepless night, and only this pain, aching in my chest, was what was left of me. My first thoughts were of them, Michael and Alice. I couldn't forget their faces. I couldn't erase what had happened. Michael and I had been friends since childhood, from the very first grade. We had our ritual brotherly bond that lasted for years, and I always believed that he was my reliable friend, the one who wouldn't betray me. And she, Alice, with her, I dreamed of the future, built a family, planned a life. She became more than just a wife to me. She became a part of myself. She was my support, and so her betrayal wasn't just a betrayal of one day. It was a blow to the very core of my existence. I walked through the streets, and all the while, I felt like my steps were just moving in a circle. I no longer sought answers from anyone else. I wasn't looking for support. My soul was empty, and the only thing I could do was just keep walking. I didn't pay attention to the people around me. They were living their ordinary daily lives, which had nothing to do with my pain. They couldn't understand me, and I couldn't even try to tell them what I was feeling. I stood in front of the bar, where I had once spent time with friends, and this place had once again become my refuge, where I could for a moment leave my thoughts behind. But only for a moment, because I knew the pain would remain with me, no matter how much I tried to hide it. The bar was half empty, the usual place that by now meant very little to me. The same bartenders, the same clients. I ordered a drink and sat at a corner table. I was alone in my thoughts, thoughts that had no end. All these emotions, all this painful feeling of emptiness haunted me as I swallowed another drink. I felt how the alcohol slowly clouded my thinking. And though it wasn't a solution, it at least dulled the sharpness. But I couldn't deceive myself anymore. There was no relief in this. I could bury my feelings under alcohol, but they didn't disappear. They were here, inside me, like scars that wouldn't heal. During another sip, I heard a familiar voice. It was John, another old friend I hadn't seen in a few years. He was the one who always tried to support me during difficult times. But this time, I didn't have the strength for even a polite conversation. I just threw out short phrases, devoid of any emotion. John looked at me carefully, and his gaze seemed to see everything. He understood something had happened, and without asking directly, he immediately changed the subject. "How are you?" His question was simple, but I felt he was expecting an answer. An answer I couldn't give, because even I didn't know how to respond to that question. How can you answer when everything that was your world is destroyed? I lowered my head and took another sip. "You know what it's like to be trapped," I said to him. But he just remained silent, knowing that I wasn't seeking sympathy, that I didn't want anyone to pity me. I just wanted someone to understand. I hadn't lost just a wife or a friend. I had lost myself. The evening ended, and with it, my attempts to find relief. My soul remained empty, and I didn't know if I would ever find the path to inner peace. I left the bar, but I was still left with the same questions and the same pain. Would I ever be able to forget? Would this ever pass? It wasn't just a period of disappointment. It was a bitter reality that I now had to endure. All these experiences left marks on my heart, scars that would never heal with time. And though I tried to find answers to my questions, I was still standing still, holding on to this pain, not knowing how to rid myself of it. Days and nights blended into an unbroken chain of memories, disappointments, and pain. I could no longer even tell what day it was. My head was filled with a constant dull silence, drowning out all other sounds. I tried to find some sense of reality, but even that had become an impossible task. I was alive, but I didn't feel life. Every step was heavy, and every breath felt like a battle with my own body. My hands still trembled when I turned on my phone, trying to avoid contact with people. They were all reminders that I was no longer the person I once was. I didn't want to hear any words of sympathy, didn't want anyone to try to understand me. I was no longer ready to open my doors to anyone. It was hard even being with myself. I knew the only thing that could help me forget was to go to the bar. Every time I went there, it was as though I lost touch with reality, and it gave me temporary relief. There, I could drink and not think. There, I could be just another patron, masked in the shadows of other people. Alcohol was my only friend. That evening, when I ended up in the bar again, I didn't even remember why I had gone there. Everything was as usual. Low tables, dim lighting, quiet conversations at the bar counter. The bartender looked at me, and I just nodded in response, signaling what I needed. As always, I ordered another strong drink and sat at a corner table. The bar was half empty, but I didn't notice. All I could see was the bottle in front of me, filling the emptiness in my soul. There were no interesting people in the bar. The ones sitting at the tables seemed as empty as I was. It felt like I was just waiting for something, but I couldn't understand what. And then, when I had almost forgotten about all the surrounding troubles, someone approached me. It was John again. He was right there, and I didn't know why. He sat at my table without invitation, silently looking at me. His gaze was penetrating, but it didn't demand an answer. He was just waiting. "How are you?" He finally broke the silence. I looked at him, and his face showed an understanding that couldn't be empty. He didn't have words of pity or sympathy. His look was simple, without questions. He was just waiting for me to respond. I nodded in surprise. What could I say? What could I explain in this state? My thoughts were racing, and I didn't know how to stop them. "It's all pointless," I answered, lifting the glass to my lips. Felt like every word was heavy, every movement of my body burdened me. The feeling of emptiness didn't leave, but instead, it seemed to be growing. I was no longer who I had been before all this. John quietly looked at me, not trying to interfere, and at that moment, I understood. I couldn't go back anymore. I was no longer the person I was, and I didn't even know if I wanted to go back. All that was left was the constant longing for forgetfulness, to let go of this pain. But I didn't know how to do it. My thoughts, as always, returned to that phone call, to that moment when I heard the moans, to the moment when my reality was shattered. I didn't know why I felt so powerless, why I couldn't stop all of this, why I allowed my life to turn into ruins. I sat in the same darkness that was in my head, unable to escape, because I had long stopped believing that there was an exit. I raised the glass, took a sip, and looked at John. His face expressed nothing. He probably saw that I had broken, that there was no point in my attempts to forget, in my attempts to become someone else again. Maybe he even understood that I didn't need any more words. And in that moment, I felt the darkness closing in on me, the pain creeping up again, and I could no longer change anything. I wasn't ready to forgive. I wasn't ready to leave it behind, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to do that. In the end, I left the bar again. As always, I left it with an empty heart. But now I knew that I couldn't escape from myself, from what had happened. And even though I kept moving forward, I understood that this pain would stay with me, no matter how long I tried to hide it. And then I realized I could no longer leave this behind. I couldn't escape this darkness. It had become a part of me. I sat in the darkness, not knowing what to do next. My soul was torn to pieces, and my mind couldn't comprehend how to return to a normal life after what had happened. I had lost everything. My wife, my hope for the future, and worst of all, I had lost myself. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a catastrophe that destroyed everything I had hoped for. But now, when I look at all of this, I realize that maybe this is exactly why I need to change. I don't know how to do it, I don't know if it's worth doing, but one thing is clear to me. Nothing will ever be the same. I have the right to revenge, but is peace worth paying such a price? Maybe all I'm looking for is simply release from this pain, but I don't know if I'll ever find it. Now I'm here, in this bar, with almost an empty glass of whiskey. I don't know what to do. They've destroyed everything I valued. I've been trying to understand how it happened that the people I trusted the most did this to me. What would you do in my place? How should I live now? Is there any point in forgiving? Or should I just sever all ties? Tell me what you think. I read every comment.